Marhaba, Masā al-Khair. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to our first poetry evening of 2022. And after 2 years of virtual poetry evenings, we are happy to be back in person. And for this special occasion, we are honored to have with us Dr. Majd al-Mallah. In his presentation, he will examine the poetics of Hafsa bint al-Hajj, women poets and women poets of Al-Andalus. Dr. al-Mallah is professor of Arabic language and literature at Grand Valley State University. He is also the coordinator of Arabic and Middle Eastern Studies. He received his PhD in Arabic and comparative literature from Indiana University. Dr. al-Mallah research focuses on modern Arabic fiction and classical poetry in the 10th and 11th century. Dr. al-Mallah has published many articles in journals and encyclopedias on classical Arabic poetry and modern Arab writers. He co-edited a dictionary of literary biography volume on 20th century Arab writers with Chili Fitzpatrick. Dr. al-Mallah published a book titled In the Shadows of the Master, Al-Mutanabbi's Legacy and the Quest for the Center in Fatimid and Andalusian Poetry. And without further ado, join me in welcoming Dr. al-Mallah.
All right. Well, thank you, Abir, for this generous introduction and your kind invitation. We've been working on putting this together for 2 years, so it's happening now. We started talking about it just when the pandemic was starting and was supposed to happen 2020, but here we are. Happy to be here in person, right? Thank you very much. I also want to thank the Sultan Qaboos Cultural Center for the invite and for promoting Arabic and Arabic culture. This is a fabulous opportunity, so thank you for the work that you do. It's fantastic. Okay, so today we're here to talk about Hafsa bint al-Hajj. I struggled with how to start introducing Hafsa to you. And I wanted to show you a photo, of course, but I soon realized they didn't have Facebook back then. So I kind of struggled, what do I do, right? So I did what any of you would do in a situation like this. I Googled it. I didn't get much results, unfortunately, no Hafsa. But I did find some interesting photos that kind of present typical, I would call stereotypical images of women in the Arab world. So I'm going to be showing you some images for your visual pleasing pleasure. Hopefully they will give you a sense of a little break as we go through this. And so this is sort of the first. This is what I found when I Googled typical, right, stereotypical images of women, and I think we all know that women are viewed in a fairly stereotypical way. Women in the Arab world, particularly in the Middle East generally. And I thought I want to show you this because I think they provide a good segue for what I plan to do today, which is to kind of work against some of those stereotypes, try to show something different as we look at Hafsa as a poet from the Andalusi period. So I'll start with a quote from Marley Hammond. It's also surprising that the literature includes some of those stereotypes or feeds into some of those stereotypes, right? And so Marley Hammond, who has an important book on women in classical Arabic literature, writes that, and I quote, "Many academics, even feminists, play down women's roles as producers of written texts, especially prose texts, with pessimistic generalization that tend to deny that women played any role at all." Hammond goes on to suggest that scholarship has promoted a misleading impression that, quote, "women's voices were predominantly stifled in Arabo-Islamic culture." In a similar vein, Julie Scott Masamy has eloquently and convincingly challenged the tendency among some scholars to use the original Arabic sources selectively in order to show women as marginalized in the classical literary tradition. So my analysis and reading here will build on Hammond's and Masamy's work, providing an examination of the importance of poetic contributions of women. Obviously, I'm not going to touch on all women. We're going to focus on Hafsa. That's going to be my focus. There is evidence to suggest that many Andalusi women were active participants in literary and cultural activities and even played a role in court venues. The tradition records several examples of women scribes who worked in the Umayyad court in Cordoba, including Muzna and Lubna, who are both documented in some of the classical sources. Hammond writes in her discussion of these women that they were not particularly exceptional with regard to the nature of their profession, but seem to have been just representatives of a female scribal class. According to one author, there is a report that in just one district of Cordoba alone, there were 170 women copying volumes of the Quran in the Kufic script. So that's interesting, right? In its own right. All right. So now that I have kind of set the stage for this talk and the focus, or sort of the where I'm going to come from, I want to tell you a little bit about the poet, the location, where she comes from, background. So I wish I can tell you that we know a whole lot about Hafsa. We don't. We know very little information. But we do know some. The most important is that she lived in the city of Granada, and I will show you some stunning pictures from Granada, I promise that. And hails from a well-known family in the city at the time. All right. The time period, I'm not sick, just so you know. The time period is the 12th century of the Common Era, 6th century Hijri, the time when the Al-Muwahhad dynasty was ruling not only North Africa, but also Al-Andalus. Even though we don't know a whole lot about Hafsa, there's a rich body of anecdotes and poetry that has been preserved in connection to her. We won't have a chance to look at all of it tonight, but I will focus on one aspect, which kind of brings into focus a relationship that she had with a famed poet by the name of Abu Ja'far ibn Sa'id. He lived in the same city. He died in the year 1165, just to give you a sense. Hafsa died in 589, 1191, just so you can sort of get a sense of it. And, hopefully I'll show you some good images, and we'll take a break with the images every now and then. I'm not going to go too much into a literature review, but I can tell you that there isn't a whole lot of sort of secondary sources that put together material analysis of Hafsa's work. A lot of it has been a reconstruction of her biography, or trying to reconstruct her biography. And all of these works really relied on al-Maqqari. And al-Maqqari is the author of the landmark work, نفح الطيب من غصن الأندلس الرطيب. It's a very famous, really important work for anyone who works on Al-Andalus. You have to work with that text. It's a multi-volume text where al-Maqqari decided to document the history and the cultural legacy of Al-Andalus. He lived in the 17th century, and he has a very interesting story, which I will tell you about, because I think it connects to how he framed the story of Hafsa. All right, so, and really my approach is to look at that piece that al-Maqqari preserved as a piece of literature in its own right. So I'm not looking at that as exclusively like a clear like historical account, or that this is like traces exactly what happened. So that's not really how I'm viewing it, but I'm viewing his work as a piece of literature, and the way that he framed Hafsa is as such. Why I decided to do that? Well, al-Maqqari provides the most extensive information about the poet, including stories and poetry not included in earlier sources. His work is in many ways the seal of classical Arabic sources on Al-Andalus. It's the last sort of classical work that documents all of it in one volume. Al-Maqqari's own experience of being exiled from his home in the Maghrib, which was a contributing factor behind his motivation to put together the most comprehensive work on the legacy of Al-Andalus, adds a further dimension to his treatment of Hafsa that has not been adequately attended to. So this is really kind of the context for why and how and what I'm trying to do with this. All right, visual break, right? Beautiful Granada, Alhambra, and I'll show you a number of them. I wish I can tell you that I have sort of images of where Hafsa lived, or any of that, but obviously I don't. But I do have images of Alhambra, and some of them are my own pictures actually that I took when I visited. But happy to talk to you about that if you're interested in the Q&A. Even though al-Maqqari includes the most information about Hafsa compared to other classical sources, the body of literature about her is still limited, and one might easily deduce her apparent marginality in a poetic tradition that is dominated by male poets. However, the preservation of Hafsa's work in the classical sources indicates that the literary establishment recognized her work. In the case of al-Maqqari, I argue that his framing of Hafsa suggests elevation rather than marginalization. Al-Maqqari brings a unique personal experience to the writing of his book, and because he actually had to leave his home under mysterious circumstances, he actually, when he left behind his books, a daughter and a wife, to whom he gave in a letter the power to obtain a divorce. So he kind of felt that he was going to leave and maybe he won't come back. And in fact, that's what happened. He ended up in Cairo, and he ended up living in the East until he died. And the point of this is to suggest that his work on Al-Andalus sort of has a retrospective view of the place. He wrote the book in his own words because of longing for the homeland. So he kind of had that nostalgic view of the Maghrib and Al-Andalus, and that was his main motivation. All right. So I argue that Al-Maqri's section is constructed to assert Hafsa's voice and to showcase her agency, and hopefully I'll show you that in the remaining minutes that we are together. I contend that Al-Maqri's section portrays Hafsa as an equal to the poet Abu Ja'far, who I mentioned, right? In the presentation of her poetry and story, not a passive beloved as we typically see in Ghazal. If you're familiar with Ghazal, and I'll talk about that later, there's a sense that there's a beloved who kind of is admired, and the focus is on her, but she sort of remains passive in that process. But Hafsa is not that person, and so that's hopefully what I'll show you today. More pictures, more nice pictures. So what I will do, so Al-Maqri's section is a pretty large section on Hafsa, and I don't have time to go through all of it, so I'm going to focus on the middle section. And the middle section includes this anecdote that only appears in Al-Maqri's work. Like a lot of the classical sources, I looked through them very carefully. None of them include this particular anecdote. And, middle sections are interesting to me because they signal liminality, they signal transition, and I think some of this section sort of signals that liminality is a feature of Arabic poetry, especially in the middle section. I teach Arabic poetry, and I talk to my students about the camels in the middle section, and we joke that the camel is the poet's BMW or Tesla. There aren't any camels here, but I'm just fascinated by that middle section. Okay. More nice pictures. Al-Maqri's section begins, with a description of the poet. All right, but we're not going to do that. I'm going to go into this section. So, Al-Maqri reports a romantic relationship between Hafsa and Abu Ja'far ibn Sa'id, right? And it's want to point out that this story, I told you that does not appear in other sources, but it is framed as a mu'arada, or an emulation of a poem. You have the text here, which has a poem that is sent by Abu Ja'far to Hafsa, encouraging her to return his love or something of that nature. Hafsa writes back to him, and we're going to go through some of those specifics now. So, the first section of the anecdote sets up a dialectic of a complicated relationship that involves Hafsa and two other men, the ruler of Granada, who is also the son of Al-Muhad leader Abd al-Mu'min, on the one hand, and the famous poet Abu Ja'far on the other. Al-Maqri begins his anecdote with a sketch of the main characters while also presenting the poetic piece that serves as a catalyst for the story. And so I'm going to read the translation of this, and then I'm going to read Hafsa's poetry in Arabic and in English. So as-Sayyid Abu Sa'id Ibn Abd al-Mu'min, the king of Granada, coveted Hafsa, and this made him jealous of Abu Ja'far ibn Sa'id, the poet. Notice it's an interesting kind of, the namings are really fascinating because they have some sort of inversion. And eventually leading to the latter being killed. So, the poet was eventually killed as a result of this sort of competition over Hafsa. Abu Ja'far asked Hafsa to meet, but she put him off for about 2 months, prompting him to write her the following lines of poetry. For the one whom I avoid mentioning by name, all I ask for is a sign from you. I don't see you fulfilling the promise you made to me, and I am afraid the short life will end. Yeah, this is part of that piece that you have. Today I beg you not to wait to be mine until the day of resurrection. If you had seen my state when the night set in with its darkness, I weep out of love and longing, while pigeons settle down to rest. I am a lover who's infatuated with the beloved, has prolonged passion for the one who is lost to him, the same one who does not respond to his greetings. If you won't love me back, then at least give me a sign to comfort me, for only despair leads on. Hafsa responded to Abu Ja'far with the following poem, the longest poetic piece that we have by her. يا مدعي في هوى الحسن والغرام الإمامة أتى قريضك لكن لم أرض منه نظاما أمدعي الحب يثني يأس الحبيب زماما ضللت كل ضلال ولم تفدك الزعامة ما زلت تصحب مذ كنت في السباق السلامة حتى عثرت وأخجلت بافتضاح السآمة بالله في كل وقت يبدي السحاب انسجاما والزهر في كل حين يشق عنه كمامة لو كنت تعرف عذري كففت غرب الملامة. ووجهت هذه الأبيات مع موصل أبياته بعدما لعنته وسبته وقالت له لعن الله المرسل والمرسل فما في جميعكما خير ولا لي برؤيتكما حاجة وانصرف بغاية من الخزي. I want to sort of alert you that this whole thing has a humorous aspect to it. So some of it sounds, I'll read the translation, then we'll talk about that. But keep in mind, there's a humorous element to this, all right? For the one who claims to be an imam in his desire for beauty and passion, so that was her response to him, because he was blaming her. Why haven't you returned my information? Why don't you do something, etc. Your poetry has arrived, but I did not accept its competition. Is it true that the lover's hopelessness bends the will of the one who claims to be in love? You have fully strayed from the right path, and your claim of nobility did not benefit you. you have sought out the safest course ever since you joined the race. But now you have stumbled and brought shame upon yourself by revealing your exhaustion. By God, do clouds show their harmony all the time? And doesn't a man always forgive his beloved's silence? If you knew my excuse, you would refrain from the tears of blame. And she sent these lines of poetry with the messenger who had relayed Abu Ja'far's poetry after she had cursed him and insulted him, saying, God curse you, curse the sender and the messenger alike, for there is no good in either of you, and I do not need to see the two of you. Be gone from my sight and go in shame. So that was what she said, right? Hafsa's response to Abu Ja'far represents the longest and fullest piece that we have by the poet. Read in the context of the anecdote, the poem asserts Hafsa's response to Abu Ja'far's own poem cited earlier, one that follows the same rhyme and meter, which constitutes a mu'arada, or a formal imitation, to his earlier composition. We must not miss the significance of the presentation of Hafsa's poem as a mu'arada, which is intended as a form of emulation and admiration for another poet's work. But as I have shown in other work, a mu'arada is an indication of equality. So you do a mu'arada to an equal. And so this is sort of a key point in the piece that I write, just to try to show that Hafsa is presented as an equal to Abu Ja'far, not as someone who's sort of admired passively and so on. All right, so skip. I'm not going to discuss all the lines, but I am going to discuss the last one because I think it's really, really important. So she talks of having an excuse, or udhr in Arabic, for not seeing him in that line, the last line. The second part of it requires further discussion because of the ambiguity and play on words. The apparent meaning, which is how I decided to translate the line, so I just kind of took it at face value and translated it with the apparent meaning in mind. Is the suggestion that if the poet knew Hafsa's excuse, he would have stopped the tears of blame, so he wouldn't blame her, right? Hafsa uses the word gharb to mean tears instead of the more common dam' or dumu'. The word gharb in Arabic is also used to indicate a direction. So he uses gharb, which also means west, to indicate tears. So there's a play on the words, and it'll be clear hopefully soon why she's doing that. And the next word, al-malama, which means blame, also apparently has a different reference point, as it rhymes with a place that we will learn about later in the anecdote, a place called al-kamama. The anecdote that follows is the only way that the reader understands how Hafsa is playing on the word meanings and how she has an apparent code language with the poet Abu Ja'far. As we will see in the anecdote below, the apparent meaning of the tears of blame is not the meaning that Hafsa intended, and the use of gharb was really intended to suggest a direction which only Abu Ja'far can understand. That said, it's noteworthy to mention that the poet's choice of tears in classical Arabic poetry is a reference to life and reinvigoration. We can look at that as an important sort of indicator of fertility and life and so on and so forth. more nice pictures from Granada. The narrative that follows Hafsa's lines of poetry not only confirms her voice in al-Maqri's text, even beyond her poetic lines that clearly articulate her voice and strength. Hafsa sends the message to Abu Ja'far, who is waiting anxiously in the anecdote. Here's how al-Maqri's text reads. When the messenger returned to Abu Ja'far, who was waiting anxiously for him, he said to him, "What news do you have, Assam?" The messenger answered, he was really upset, right? So because he was cursed and sent home, "What news would I have, since a fool sent me to an evildoer and a neglecter? Read these lines and you'll understand." When Abu Ja'far read them, he said to the messenger, "How silly and ignorant you are. She has promised to meet me at the dome, Qubba, located in my garden, Jannah. It is called Al-Kamama. Move along and let's go." So they went to Al-Kamama, and it was not long before Hafsa arrived, and they sat down in the best of states. Okay? That's interesting. So this section of the anecdote is very important because of what it reveals about Hafsa's voice, and also the meeting with the poet Abu Ja'far that takes place in a garden. As far as Hafsa's voice is concerned, al-Maqri could have simply reported what she wanted to relay to the poet Abu Ja'far. Instead, he quotes her directly in the first person voice, right? So that's important. Here, once again, Hafsa is not only in control of her own voice through poetry and prose, but she is also an assertive woman who has the power of her word and action. The messenger, who is a male character, and this is really not to be missed, is not at the same level of Hafsa intellectually, right? As the story reveals. He does not understand the hidden meaning, right? He's kind of going back and forth, and he doesn't get it. Of the poem that he was to deliver, he only understands the apparent meaning, or the surface meaning. It takes a poet who is on par with her, an equal, if you will, to understand and respond to the message Hafsa sent him, which is suggesting a meeting that the messenger missed altogether. The meeting between the two poets takes place in a garden that Abu Ja'far refers to in this section. The reference to the garden, I have some, well, these are just amazing images of Al-Hamra, which is probably where the Al-Hamra comes from, the color, right? But these are the gardens, right? The gardens of the palace of Al-Hamra, and I just wanted you to kind of see that. The reference to the garden is an important aspect that deserves further discussion. As Samir Ali has demonstrated, the garden was among the favored places of mujalasat, or collegial salons, whose attendees gathered as equals. And he kind of goes on to kind of show how people who met into these contexts, have to be seen as equals. So the relationship between Hafsa and Abu Ja'far can be presumed to be an illicit one by the social standards of the time. Excuse me. I haven't presented for this long for a while. All right. How am I doing on time? A few minutes or? Okay. So they come together in this context, and they're talking. I'll kind of relay some of this to you, and then maybe we can have talk some more at the end. So Abu Ja'far introduces a third character, another poet by the name of Al-Kitandi, who sort of appears out of nowhere and tells Hafsa that, look at these lines of poetry where Al-Kitandi apparently knows that we are meeting. Kind of creepy and weird, right? They didn't have Facebook at the time. And asks her to comment on that. What do you think of that? And to name him. And so she names him, she calls him Al-Ha'il, who's the person who kind of separates two lovers. And the anecdote goes on to kind of explore that relationship between the two poets in the context of this third person who appears or who emerges in the background, creating another sort of triangle, if you will, right? So the triangles is an interesting dynamic in this story, because you've got the ruler of Granada, the poet Hafsa, and the poet Abu Ja'far, right? So that's the three. And then you have another triangle with Hafsa, Abu Ja'far, and then this third poet who comes out of nowhere. And I tried to make a juxtaposition between those, that they are sort of carefully constructed to show this complexity of the piece, and the intent to show Hafsa as someone who's an active participant in this discussion, that she's not just a passive person. If you look at ghazal as a form of poetry, there are a number of types of ghazals, or love poetry in the Arabic tradition. The two most famous ones are the Hijazi ghazal and the Udriya ghazal, and they have their own features, right? But one of the interesting features of them, and I'm quoting from an article by Blachel, in these meetings, the lady acts the part of the silent one. So there's the lover and the lady just sort of sits back and relaxes, and the poet is sort of coming up with this poetry. But here we see sort of an inversion of that, right? Hafsa is sort of active participant. She's sort of a feisty at times participant in this, and it's a very different dynamic than the one that we typically think of when we think of women or women poets, right? So let me just leave you with a concluding remark about what happens in the story. The introduction of the Al-Katandi brings out another triangle, like I said, that is juxtaposed to the other one. Here, Al-Katandi stands for the antagonist, while Hafsa and Abu Ja'far become the protagonists who emerge as unified and victorious in a sense. There's an element of humor that appears at the very end of the anecdote, and that is intended to lighten the mood of a very heavy topic at hand. Hafsa appears to be an active participant in shaping the remaining narrative and moving the story forward. The name that she assigns to Al-Katandi, Al-Ha'il, has semantic implications that I will explore. The word ha'il, impediment or obstacle, rhymes with the word adil or blamer, which is very common in ghazal, if you're familiar with that. Someone who questions the morality of the lovers, that's the adil. Hafsa does not describe Katandi as adil but ha'il. On the face of it, the word means the person who separates lovers, but looking at the various meanings of the word is rather interesting. Some of the implications of the word, according to Ibn Mandur, include a suggestion of infertility. Given Hafsa's command of the Arabic language and ability to understand meaning and implication in her poetic piece, to arrange the meaning with Abu Ja'far, as we saw earlier, it's not far-fetched that the poet intended to highlight the meaning of infertility here, meaning the union, like the physical union between the poet and between the two poets. Al-Katandi's effect on the relationship between the two is essentially confirming that infertility. This meaning of infertility is consistent with the themes of liminality and lack of an outcome for a relationship between the two poets on the physical level. On the poetic level, however, the story ends with a humorous episode in which Al-Katandi ends up falling from grace in a pile of dirt. It's more than dirt, let's just say. And both poets, Abu Ja'far and Hafsa, compose a joint piece making fun of him and his situation and expressing thanks for not having to deal with him in the end. And so that's how that whole story or that whole episode ends. And I'm just going to leave it there and be happy to discuss further if you have any questions. Thank you for listening.